Welcome to another live session of Seibert Media. I have a guest today. It's Simon from Comalatech. Hi, Simon.
Hi, Martin. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining in. It's early in the morning for you, later in the evening for me. I'm at home. You may see that as a viewer in the background, and you may hear my cat as well. And we will be talking about Comala Workflows, your favorite famous workflow engine for Atlassian Confluence. Can you introduce us really quick, Simon? What is that about? You're one of the most sold and most sought for solution in Confluence. Why is that?
Sure, definitely, yeah. So Comalatech, as you mentioned, so we're one of Atlassian marketplace vendors. Luckily we're one of the highest selling ones, as you mentioned, and the most popular add-on that most of our prospects and customers and people that we meet are aware of is our Comala Workflows app. One of the reasons why I think it's so successful is that it really allows you to extend the use of Confluence, which is really designed around the concept of a wiki, which is a fantastic way of collaborating on documentation and creating FAQs and any kind of documentation you can think of. But at some point, most companies find the need to have some kind of a formal approval process. So whether you're just a company developing product specs, or you're a company that's building medical devices and you need to actually conform to compliance standards, Workflows allows you to really extend the functionality of Confluence beyond just a great collaboration tool for everyone to chat about and add their content to an actual proper functioning publishing tool, where you can have proper approval and review process built into the lifecycle management of all of your documentation. So this is really one of the reasons why I think Workflows is such a popular tool, because most organizations, again, at some point, they reach a point where they need a vetting process for their pages. They have to have some control, but they don't want to lose the collaborative spirit of Confluence. So we kind of provide that balance where, yes, you can continue to collaborate, all the good stuff people use Confluence for, but still manage that lifecycle properly, the right groups involved, the right steps, and different approval processes you might have.
Yeah, cool. That already summarizes that nicely. Let me offer you two categories for people who are using workflows in Confluence. One is you have to use a workflow because you're trying to achieve a certification for an ISO or another standard that may be imposed on you by people you're working with, your customers, or just your own wish to live up to high quality standards. Then you obviously have to live by a workflow to make sure that when an auditor drops in, you can say, okay, this guy approved that, this guy looked over that, this is the process that we followed, these were the revisions, and so on. So having to use a workflow for the use case would be one. And the other is you're free to use a workflow. You could just as well use no workflow, but you decide that it's better for your company if you have a workflow that gives you control. If you're using those two categories, how would you, how many % of your customers are in the one bracket and how many are in the other?
Yeah, definitely. So what Workflows allows you to do as well, as you mentioned, is it does give you the flexibility to choose sort of which category you fall in. So we have the concept of what we call a space workflow, which automates the assignment of workflows to the page. So this is the category where it's not optional in most cases. Either it's internally mandated or they're running under a compliance purview, so they have to have workflows assigned. But I would say that that's actually probably, for the people that actually need it, I would say that's probably about 80% of our customers, where for various reasons, and again, it may not be a compliance restriction, but in a lot of cases, even for internal purposes, they don't want necessarily their page creators to be responsible or have the onus on them to remember to add a workflow. They want to be able to make sure that these pages are being managed properly, so we can automate that. But we also have other customers that either it's a smaller team or they have a very well-defined documentation team that are responsible for. They might have multiple different workflows and they pick and choose based on this type of page. We want to allow the page creators the control to do that. So definitely there's a possibility, but we also see a hybrid of that where certain pages or certain spaces need to be more highly regulated, but they also have spaces for their social committee pages. Where someone just needs to, yes, I need to have a quick look at this, or I need someone to sign off on it, but it's not as regulated. So you can have one or the other or both. So we provide the flexibility to do both. But I would say for sure the most common use case, I'd say 75 to 80%, are customers where it's not a question of if, you have to have the workflow. So they would use our space workflow functionality to make sure that anytime a page gets created, it automatically assigns the workflow. And the workflows can be based off of a space. They can be based off of a blueprint from Confluence. So it may be multiple different types of workflows depending on the type of page you're creating.
We definitely have to look into that later, how we do that. And I think this is also a very compelling thing in Comala Workflows, that you can actually steer that yourself and you don't have to be a coder or a system administrator to create and maintain workflows. Do you have an example for pages who turn into a need where they now need a workflow while in the beginning they didn't?
Yeah, often it's actually quite common I was actually speaking with a prospect this morning that they had originally started using Confluence for very basic documentation needs. So again, it was more to have a collaborative space where they could document certain procedures or just information that they needed to store. But they never saw using Confluence beyond that sort of very basic needs. They might have large groups of people in there, but it was more of just, again, it was a wiki. It was a place for them to gather feedback and comments, but it was very, it's often very unregulated. But then they often find, well, hey, we're using our Confluence for all this documentation. We could be using it for even more than that. We already own this platform. So rather than going to some other kind of more expensive content management system, they start looking around at, well, we need a review process. We need some approvals. And so we'll often come in either after they've been using Confluence for a few years as a very basic tool to something more, I don't want to say more serious, but often it's like, hey, we want to start tracking HR documentation or publicly accessible documentation where we really need to have more control over it. So that's one good use case. Another one is we often will have, we're talking about compliance. We'll often have customers or they're already using Confluence and they are acquired by another company that requires ISO or FDA compliance. It's actually quite common. Or they've started developing a product. They might have been doing R&D before, something different, and now all of a sudden they say, hey, we're going to start developing this machine for testing blood products. Well, if you start doing that, then you're in a whole other business where you have to conform to whether it's ISO 900 or 9000. ISO 13485 is very common for medical devices. So it's often a customer that their business has changed or they've been acquired by another company that says, hey, you need to do this. And then sometimes it's just internally mandated. They decide, hey, you know what? We really need to be better at managing our documentation. Here's an internal mandate that says you need to conform to some structure. How are we going to do that? We don't want to throw Confluence away. It's a great tool. We can use workflows for this.
There's a question that is pretty related to what you've been saying, like which standards can this workflow engine satisfy? Sure.
Yeah, definitely. So the ones we see most commonly for sure are FDA, specifically around electronic signatures. There's part 11-21, which specifically deals with the management of your data and electronic signatures that we can actually provide the functionality for. ISO 9000, also, again, that has more to do with just internal standards. We see that a lot. And then again, something that I mentioned before that's been coming up probably more often in the last year are with medical device manufacturers. So they have to adhere to a standard called ISO 13485. So it's one of the many ISO ones, but that's a very specific one to people that are designing and selling medical devices. So those are the three that we regularly encounter, but we find that in Europe, for example, there's numerous other standards and compliance regulatory compliances, and most of them we have found, luckily, follow the same requirements. So it's typically around proper authentication of users who are approving pages, proper maintenance of review cycles, things like that. So even those three I mentioned tend to be the most common ones that we encounter. There are other ones that we have also worked with that happen to have the same set of requirements. So you can use workflows for those as well. So
I know that German car manufacturers issue their own standards that they then ask their suppliers to look by. So that's also something that I think makes Comalatech workflows or Comala Workflows very powerful. My answer would be Comala Workflows can satisfy all of those standard workflows because it's so versatile and you can define yourself. Would you say you're the expert in all these standards? Probably not, right? You're the experts in helping craft a workflow for it.
Yeah, so for sure, our business isn't necessarily compliance, although we do work with some great partners like Seibert Media that do have expertise in those areas, particularly regionally, like as you mentioned, the German car manufacturers. But yeah, our wheelhouse, our forte definitely is providing the flexibility and knowledge on the workflows themselves to provide whatever type of workflow the client might need. So again, there's no anyone who is in compliance. Compliance is a very broad subject. There's no silver bullet that says, hey, here's a solution that's going to solve all of it, because of course compliance is not just software. But when we start talking about documentation, controlled pages, things like that, that's really where we can help. And that's where the sort of the software piece comes in with Confluence, when you start managing these controlled documents. So that's kind of where our expertise falls. Being able to create a flexible enough solution that regardless of the type of standard you might have to comply with, we can most likely create a workflow that's going to meet your needs.
Okay. Let me add something that I encounter a lot with customers. And it's basically that introducing a wiki to standard procedures in companies is still something that is a new field for most companies. So the notion that everyone can edit a page and that everything is transparent to everyone by default is something that a lot of especially high-level managers have to adapt in the beginning in their thinking and then also in their experience. And when we plan wiki projects with managers and through our linchpin solution, we're doing that as big internet projects for massive companies with thousands of employees. There's always a hierarchy in those companies, and a lot of decisions and a lot of documents travel through this hierarchy, and there's a distinct situation between who says what should be in the document and who may write it or make it pretty or write all the long stuff. And now in this wiki, everything gets much faster and more collaborative and more iterational. And what I see a lot is that customers employ workflows to maintain some level of control. So there's no need for them to do that. They don't. We do see a lot of use cases in quality management, quality handbooks, and so on. I would say it's mandatory to have a workflow there. But a lot of it is also like an adoption curve for control needing managers. Do you see that a lot with your customers?
Yeah, definitely. So it's very common, particularly with clients that are. We regularly see Atlassian customers that are using Jira. So Confluence is not necessarily something they had ever planned on using, but they realize, hey, there's this tool there, and it's this wiki tool. And often it's the users who love the idea of a collaborative wiki because it provides a lot of interaction and collaboration, and it can really speed up your process. But it's the managers that typically are nervous about the idea of, hey, this is this open wiki. I mean, they get very nervous. So this is actually where, in a lot of cases, the I think the need for a product like Workflows came from the beginning. Roberto, our CEO, I think this is where he came up with the idea, is like, hey, there's this fantastic collaborative documentation tool, but businesses are nervous to use it because it's sort of like, is this the Wild West? So again, this is probably the number one reason, and it's typically the managers, even the IT teams, where they realize, you know what, we can't just have everybody in there messing around with a document. How do we know when it's done? How do we know it's actually done and it's gone through the necessary approvals? What if somebody changes the document? It's been approved, but they've made a change. It's not a problem. Workflows can accommodate that. So you know that all of your documentation, even where the documentation ends up, once it's been finished being approved, you can control all that. So yes, you can enjoy that collaborative documentation functionality, but for the managers that need to have some assurances that the documentation has been reviewed and it's not just anybody's show, that's where really the value comes. And they're actually the biggest proponents in the end of our Workflows product, because they say, hey, I see the value of this collaboration. We need to have control of that. Workflows provides that level of control of those documents. And again, it could be a 1 or 2 step process. Maybe you only have you just need some very limited, whereas you might have much more complex review processes for different types of pages as well.
Okay, so this has been a lot of, let's call it cheap talk.
Sure.
The interesting thing is seeing is believing. So we want you to maybe show your screen and walk us around in the linear solution so that people can pick up how to use it. How about you just start with what you normally show in your sessions, and then I pick up questions that we get, and I will have a lot of my own questions as well, I think.
For sure. So let me go ahead and share out my desktop here. And you should see my Confluence instance.
It's working.
Excellent. So just so you guys know that we're not all smoke and mirrors, what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to start with just a very basic page approval to kind of give you an idea of some of the concepts, because there are some concepts that we'll introduce that are maybe new to Confluence users. Most people are familiar with the concepts, but being able to then apply it to Confluence in a useful way. So I'm going to show you a very basic approval, and then I'm actually going to move on to something a little bit more complex when we start to get into more of a QMS maybe type document lifecycle management, where you have multiple different states. So let's go ahead. I'm going to just go ahead and create a new page. I've got it. My workflows have been set up. I'm in a specific space that I've got created, and I'm just going to go ahead and create a new page. I'll just call this.
To interrupt you quick, we will assume that you know some Confluence here. So this is not going to be a Confluence beginners course. And I'm asking Simon to make it one. So let's just focus on the pure workflow stuff.
Sure, definitely, yeah. So I'm definitely going under the assumption that the audience is somewhat familiar with Confluence, but we're also going to keep it very basic, page creation, nothing else. So this is pretty standard stuff in Confluence. So hopefully it shouldn't be, it won't be too complex. So I'm just going ahead and creating a standard page in Confluence with some test data. And we're going to go ahead and publish this page. Now, the way that Confluence works, typically, if you have a page created in a space like I've just done, Confluence, of course, does have its own security built into it. So you can create groups, you can create users, and based on the groups and the users, you can define who's allowed to view and edit the spaces in your Confluence instance. So you can still control, obviously, who has access to view and edit which spaces in Confluence. Now, normally, I've just created this page. What would happen is any user that has even minimal view rights to this space is automatically going to see this page, whether it's ready or not. It's there now. It's been published. It's saved. So that content is there. It hasn't been reviewed yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add a workflow. And the example that I'm showing you, adding this manually, you see here I mentioned before one of the questions that Martin asked was about sort of the automation or making sure that workflows are applied automatically. And this is an example of that. So this first window that pops up is actually asking me, do you want to just apply this to this page, or do you want to apply it to the whole space? And if I was to select the space option, after that, every time I create a page in this space, it's automatically going to apply the same workflow. So that's that difference between the sort of the page level workflow and then actually automating it at the space level. For the demo purposes, I'm just going to apply it to this page. It gives me a couple of options that I could add to the page. It's going to give me a list of all of the built-in ones. So we do ship the product, of course, with a number of different default ones. But as I mentioned again also before, one of the reasons why a lot of people use the tool is because it's also very flexible. So you can actually build your own workflows. And I have some custom ones that I built in here as well. But in this case, I'm just going to grab just the built-in simple approval, very basic one-step approval. Nice and easy. I'm going to go ahead and apply that. And so now I've assigned that to my page. So the first thing you'll notice is now there's this orange circle, and it's just indicating that this page is now in progress. So one of the first concepts that I'll mention, this orange circle, what that's indicating is that this page is now what we call a draft page. So this is one of the really important concepts in workflows, is that we allow you to control or maintain these different types of page states, which in this case is a draft page. And what that means is anybody that only has view rights to this space will no longer be able to see this draft page because it hasn't been approved yet. So this is actually something you can control in our configuration, basically who's allowed to view draft pages. And by default, we say, if you only have view rights, so sort of general user population, you cannot see draft pages. So in sense, what we're doing is we're hiding these draft pages until they've gone through the appropriate approval process. So again, draft, and eventually it'll become a published page with that draft page status, sort of very important to how the tool works. So we've got this created. We can approve or reject it because we haven't assigned it to anybody else. We could approve it ourselves. But again, in most cases, you're going to probably assign that to a specific user. So in this case, and again, this is a basic one, so it's a manual review assignment. So I could say, all right, well, I actually wanted to assign this to Susan, for example. So we are pulling, of course, the names from the Confluence database. So there's not a separate group of users or groups that we have to maintain in workflows. It's actually coming from your Confluence database. We can also add notes for them as well, of course. So if you just want to give them a bit of instruction, please view.
But what I know, what you can do, which I think is very helpful, is you can define a group of people who should be reviewers. So for example, if you have a multi-step approval workflow, you could say those 5 could be reviewers, right?
Exactly, yeah. So you can assign, so this again, really basic, and when we get into a little bit more complex one, I'll point out that one as well, but for sure, one of the things you can do is you can automatically assign either specific users, a user, a group of individual users, or an entire group. So you might actually have a page reviewers group that gets automatically assigned to pages for review, or you might have multiple groups. So for sure, you can actually build that into the workflow. So again, we allow that flexibility where if you do have an instance like this example is a basic, so it's like, hey, I'm just going to add somebody myself, but in many, many cases, probably the majority of cases, our customers will want to automate that. So they'll just say, no, the user doesn't have to pick them. It's going to be part of the workflow. It's going to automatically assign it to the appropriate person. So that's definitely an option that you have. But again, we want to keep it flexible because every customer has slightly different requirements. So for sure, that's something you can automate. So I've assigned this now to Susan. You can see that we can add multiple people here if you wanted to. They would all have to approve it, but I'm just going to leave it with Susan for now. Something else that's, I think, important to note, and you'll see it's still in progress, is for the actual page approvers. So assigning the workflows is important, but probably the more important step is actually making sure that the people that are responsible for approving the pages, they actually know that they've been assigned to a page. If they don't know, probably not going to go in and look for it. And that it's very easy for them to actually go in and approve the page they've been given. Because we know if the process is too difficult, users won't want to have to do it. It's too much work. I'm not going to bother. So we've tried to streamline that. So I'm going to just very quickly just show you what it looks like for Susan, because I think it's important to get a sense of from the approver's perspective, because again, that's such a key role in the process. Just log in as Susan. So a couple of different ways that we notify your approvers. First, if you want, you can turn on, we have an email notification option, which actually sends that approver an email. A lot of our customers really like that idea because it's external to Confluence. We know that not all users are sitting around in Confluence just waiting to be assigned to pages. So you can send them an email and it says, hey, you've been assigned to review this page with whatever note you've put. We do use in-app notifications as well, of course. So they are going to get a notification within Confluence. So if they are in Confluence, they'll see that. And then lastly, what we've also done is we've carved a little section out of the dashboard in Confluence. So anything that's assigned to them from the Workflows app, page approvals, tasks, it's going to show up in here. So we can actually see that test approval page, the note that we've given them. And so rather than that user having to go digging around through your Confluence hierarchy, they can go directly to the page and say, oh, okay, I've been asked to review, and click on that.
Let me iterate on this task box on the dashboard that you've shown. The more workflows you have and the more complex they get, the more situations you will have where someone has to do something. In a lot of cases, those workflows, as Simon has said, will be triggered automatically. For example, a document grows old. Now someone has to review it if it's still current, or someone is not approving something, he's not reacting, then you may want to escalate this to someone else. So you will find new tasks for different reasons sitting in that inbox. And it's something that is new for a lot of our quality management managers, and also something that is very, very helpful to make sure that when you want your company be certified, that people understand that there's a one-place quality management tasks where they can look and find out everything that they have to do. And
exactly, yeah. And that's really why we built this this section into, because again, as you start to get more and more pages being created and people being assigned to them, we wanted to make sure that it was sort of a one spot where everything that was assigned to these users was being stored, so they didn't have to go digging for it. Exactly, because again, user adoption is important, usability and accessibility is extremely important. Or those, like I said, those page reviewers are going to be like, there's no way I can do this, I just don't have time. So by having this special spot allocated to it, they don't have to go anywhere. It just makes it very easy for them. So they can go in, as I mentioned, go in and say, okay, I can see this really great content. They can add a comment themselves if they want. That looks great. They can approve. Now, if I had multiple people assigned to it, of course, they would all need to approve before it was published, but we only had just Susan. So we can see now this circle turns green. The page has been approved. Now, what this indicates, of course, is that the page has actually been published. So again, very basic one step, but it's been reviewed, it's been approved. It's now a published page. So that means all of your view-only users in this space are going to be able to now see this page because, again, it's gone through your approval process. I'm just going to quickly go back in as my original page creator. One of the things that I had mentioned before as well, pages in Confluence tend to be constantly evolving. So they're being updated and modified very frequently. So another very common use case, of course, is, well, I've gone in and I've created this page, it's been approved, but I need to make some changes to it. So we go in and we can say some changes. I'm going to update that. And this is a very important concept. So what's happened now is, okay, we've made these changes. So let's kick this page back to this in progress state because the pages haven't been, or the changes haven't been reviewed yet. But something that's quite different about what we're doing with workflows is we still have the last approved version of this page. So this is what your users are actually going to see. So you don't have to lock the page down because you want to continue editing it. It's still going to give you the last published version of the page. That's going to be available to your users. But we have this in progress, or this draft version that we can continue to work on in the background. When we're happy with the changes, it goes back through the review process. Assuming it gets approved, that becomes your new published page. So you're going to see this sort of two different states of this page, where you have this published version and then you have a draft version, and it's going to go back and forth between that as updates are made. So again, draft and published, really important concept, and that's really how we're controlling these pages, because we have this new concept of a sort of a hidden draft that you can work on in the background, and whatever the last published or approved version. So again, very important concept, very, very basic workflow, but you can kind of get that idea. So now if we take that same idea and we expand the idea of the document lifecycle, something a little more than just mandatory, or sorry, a manual, I'm going to assign a workflow and approve it.
Let me jump in for another comment, please.
Sure.
Something that I encounter a lot with our customers is that they say, all these certifications, They are only business theater. So we are playing a business theater for those people who audit us until we get the certification. And then we go back to normal business. And so in a lot of cases, those companies kind of stage how they do quality, and then there's a way of how they do work. And what you just showed, when a page is edited and the published version still remains active, allows a lot of flexibility where actually this business theater can turn into a lively quality enhancing activity where you can have, on the one hand, your published certified process, and then still the living document that Confluence is so powerful in, where people can do small changes, suggest something, people can roll back, they can discuss, they can add comments, and all of this stuff in the in progress document that people can still look at, but it's not the official version. And that's
exactly
a very, very big difference to all those old Word documents, printed pages with 50 signatures beneath them, where people know when they get the file, like the paper file, they know, I don't want to look into that. It's not going to be relevant for today's processes that we have here. It's just a thing that we print out once the certification process starts. And this is something that completely changes when you introduce Confluence with such a workflow engine, because now you can keep on living in those documents, although they may not be approved yet. And people may lag behind with their approvals. Still, all the documents can still change.
Exactly, yeah, and that was one of the most important pieces of what we're doing, because of course, Confluence does tend to be, the documents are sort of living documents in that they are constantly being updated. Even with Confluence itself, if you wanted to say, we've got a page that's been finished, but we need to do some work on it and we don't want the users to be accessing it, you'd have to essentially go in and change the security to lock it down, which is not an administrative task that most admins want to have to deal with. So we're basically allowing you to say, yep, no problem. If you've approved a page, that page is the one that is going to be visible, but we're going to give you this draft page to work on in the background until you're happy with those changes. So it's like having two versions of this page. The one that your users are seeing that's been reviewed and approved, and the one that your page creators and editors can work on comfortably in the background, knowing it's not going to be available to the users until it's gone through the proper approval and review process. So exactly, that's the business need that that was so prevalent with Confluence. We love Confluence, but we need to control these pages, and that's what Workflows is doing for you.
Okay, let's move on to more complex things.
You bet. So let me go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and grab. Actually, I'm going to just create this page. This is important stuff. Publish this. So again, in this case, I'm going to go in and I'm going to grab a different workflow. In this case, I'm actually going to apply it to the space. And I'll show you this afterwards when we create. We'll do one last page creation and just show you how that space workflow works. And I'm actually going to grab this basic compliance workflow. Now, this is one that I doctored up slightly. It's actually based on our editor and staff workflow. It's built in. Super common workflow use case. So it's a multi-step approval, but this one has a few extra things built in that I'm going to point out that I think will be useful. So let's go ahead and we'll add this to the space. And so now I'm going to go back to my, this is just letting us know that we've actually added it to the space, and go into my control document. So we can see now we've added this. We can see that draft, that orange circle. But if you go and have a look in here, you can actually see, so this one actually has a few different states. So it's going to go through more than one step to get to the end where it's finally published. Now the states themselves, again, this is all coming from the actual workflow that you can manipulate and you can customize. So the name of the states, there's not sort of a default dozen states to choose from. You can call them whatever you want, whatever makes the most sense in your particular organization. It may not be English, it might be in German. So of course you can call the states something that's applicable. In this case, we're going to kind of walk through this and just show you what it looks like from beginning to end, where you have multiple different states involved and different groups that are involved in the process. So we can see we've created this draft, we've got our important stuff, we're ready for it to go into the review process. I can go ahead and submit this. Now this one is actually gone into the ready state. So now it's ready to be reviewed. Now, this particular workflow, we do have the option of where you can still allow people to add users manually, but in this case, this particular review is actually assigned to a group called reviewers, and I happen to be a member of the reviewers. So that's already included as part of the workflow. So you could leave this blank. You don't have to add a reviewer. You could even get rid of that altogether. I don't want to have any manual assignment. I'm going to take it out. This group of reviewers is going to be assigned and notified, hey, there might be 6 or 8 people that are part of that group that need to go in and have a look. You can also say, well, I only need 1 or 2 of those people to actually review this page. So you can weight your approvals as well. So in this case, now, again, normally this would be done by different people, but rather than logging in and out and getting more complex than it needs to be, I'm just going to approve it myself. But before I do that, I'm going to say, looks good. And get to approve. So now the last step in this one is called our editor-in-chief. This could be your compliance officer in this specific case. And what's different about this particular review is you'll notice that last one, I just approved it. I said, yeah, it's approved, and it's moved on to the next review state. So it hasn't been published yet. It's been reviewed, but that was just that first step. The next one is our editor-in-chief. And for this particular one, because again, for most of our compliance clients, part of the control document management is that you actually have to have a digital signature or an authentication prompt. So you can't just say, yes, I'm approving it. You actually have to prove who you are. So in this case, I would actually have to provide login credentials. And then I could say, approve. So I've published the page, but in this case, again, one of the things that I've also added is that, and again, this is not necessarily just for compliance, but one of the requirements for ISO and FDA and 1345 is manual review cycles as well. So even if the page doesn't get changed, it depends on the standard that you're working under. Sometimes it's 12 months, sometimes it's 18 months, but there has to be a mandatory review cycle. And what I've actually done is I've actually added an expiry, which in a year from now, it's going to say this needs to go back to be reviewed, even if it hasn't been changed. So it's just, again, some of the different features that are you can build into that workflow, whether it's for internally mandated auditing or if it's actually ISO or FDA, something like that. So you can use those features. So you can see now we've published the page. It's turned green. It's been published. But just like that basic workflow that we saw, if I make an update, back to my ready state, but we still have the last published version that is available. So again, draft versus published, very important. Something else too, just before we wrap up that workflow, very important to keep in mind as well. So that one's gotten kicked back, that can go back to the review process. But if I have a look at the published version, and I can actually go in, and we talked a little bit about auditing, or that's actually come up a few times. But one of the things that we're also doing is we're keeping a detailed record of everything that's happened to this page. And I think this is just useful for any organization to have some kind of a paper trail of here's what's happened, here's who's approved it, any notes that they may have added. If something's maybe been approved that it shouldn't, you can roll back to a different version. So I think it's useful information. But again, when we start talking about compliance, this is actually, you have to be able to produce this level of detailed page history, because this is what the auditors will actually want to see. So what's happened with your pages. So again, just a sort of a side note, but just something that we are managing. It's not just, hey, you can throw it on there and kind of fake what's happening with your pages, with your workflows. We're actually keeping a detailed history of each and every page. And we also keep an administrative audit log as well. So any changes that are made to the app, this is another thing that's often required when you get into sort of more serious compliance auditing. They have to be able to see, did your admin change any of your workflows? Have they added new things to the workflows to make sure that your process is still meeting your compliance requirements? So again, we're keeping page level history, and we're keeping admin audit logging detailed history of that as well. So just a few extra features.
There's a funny story that I can tell you about this. With multiple customers, actually, I have seen that. Can you go back really quick to the activity page? That they said, oh, we need in Germany that's called Lenkungszeile, or you could also call it a document control element. And in those old Word documents, they had like the very first pages they consisted or contained those activity reports. So they would fill that out manually. Who did what on which date and what was the change? And we still have customers asking for that. So can I now export my Word document so that I can still see this stuff? And it's pretty difficult to explain to people that this type of activity report is now generated by the system. You can print it out, but it's not part of the original document. It's kind of an attachment or enhancement to this. And it's a very long discussion always for people to understand that they don't have to keep up the way they printed out files yesterday. That this is now in a system that is automatically maintaining this. May sound funny, but it's happening over and over again.
Yep. And what we find too with clients is that often they become so accustomed to the concept of having an approval with your pages. It's not new. Even before there were Confluence or digital systems to do that. But like you said, Martin, it was a manual process and took a long time. And people had folders and folders of information that they had to keep. And eventually people will.
Right? You can't fake it.
Exactly. No, it's in there. You can't. The only reason why I have access to all this, of course, is because I'm an admin. But what we're trying to do, and again, what happens eventually is your page creators, they forget that Workflows is even there. It's just part of the process. And this activity that's going on behind the scenes, it's all just there. And they very quickly adapt to, wow, now I can focus on the documentation that I have to create. Now I can focus on the content that I have to develop and not worry about, well, I have to, make sure that I'm logging what I've added and make sure that I'm going to print that and take it to my superior. So all of a sudden there's this automated processes happening without even their knowledge. And actually, just to kind of give you an idea of that, you remember when I added that last workflow, I opted for that space workflow option. So if I was to go in now and say, okay, well, now I need to do I'm creating a new control document. Control doc.2 with some info. Publish this. So you see, I didn't do anything that time. It's automatically assigned this workflow. So automatically, this page is now hidden. Your view only or your general user population will not see the page. The user didn't have to do anything. The page creator didn't have to do anything. The workflow is just there. And now it's just, it's just part of the life cycle of this page. And this is the review process that's going to be included for any page that's created in this space. So again, we're trying to automate it, make it as easy as possible. You have a review, you have a proper approval. So you know your pages have been vetted when they're being visible, but you can still create them, collaborate on them, add comments. So again, that's kind of our big, the big value for us is that we want you to enjoy the functionality and the flexibility and freedom to create good documentation with Confluence, but not worry about, is it being tracked? Are we approving pages properly? Is there a history being tracked so we know what's happened to these pages, and that's all been happening in the background.
Here's a question. How do I create or adapt a workflow like this?
Sure. So all of the workflows are actually based on, and go into my Comala Workflows. So we can see this particular workflow. So as I mentioned, they're all based on different states and transitions. So right now, all of the workflows are actually designed via and actually I'm going to go into my global workflow so I can show you an edit one. So we use a markup language. So all the workflows are actually based off of a macros in Confluence. So again, that's maybe a little bit more complex concept, but anyone on the call that is familiar with Confluence, you're probably quite familiar with the concept of macros. So essentially, we're using a collection of macros that we're putting together in a markup. So for example, if I go into my basic compliance workflow that we were just using and go into edit, so you can see here where we actually have all of the workflow. And it's actually not, I know this is always, people think it's a little bit daunting, but honestly, it's it's only a few lines to do all 4 of those different states. But this is actually how you can go in and you can manipulate things like...
Walk us through one of those lines, and then I
Yeah,
think
definitely.
you easily understand how it works.
For sure. So, and you're going to see the same things over and over again, because again, it's just to state the same macro. So we have where we're identifying the workflow itself, what you want to call it, change the name if you want, the description, if you want to have descriptions in the workflows so people going back in can see them, any parameters. Parameters are a little bit more complex, but you can use parameters instead of hard values that you can identify later. But I think probably the most interesting thing, or the best thing to take away from this, is here's where you're actually identifying the states. So if you want to call the state something else, just change the name. And actually, what I normally do if I need to create a new workflow is I find one that I already have that's similar, so I don't have to build it from scratch. So I'll actually build it from there. So the name of the state, what happens when you submit it, for example, when we submitted it to Ready, this where we're actually identifying that. We were also identifying, probably the most important thing is the approval process itself. So within the state, we're actually identifying if it gets approved, where does it go? It goes to the reviewed state. If it gets rejected, it goes back to draft. And we're also identifying who's responsible for approving it. So I mentioned before that it was actually assigned to a group called reviewers. So this is where you can actually identify, is it an individual user? Is it multiple users? Or actually,
you are automatically charting the workflow, right?
Exactly. Yep. So it was already in there. And then again, the last state we had was our editor-in-chief. So this is that last once it's been reviewed. If it's approved, then it goes to published. If it gets rejected, where does it go? So these are just...
I have for the viewers now. Like, if you're seeing this markup language, and if you're longer familiar with the product, you may remember that once in a while, in the very beginning, there was a visual editor for this, and now there's only this markup. What I'm interested in is, do you think that this markup is easy to understand, or do you think there should be a visual editor coming back from Comala Workflows one day? It's a question that we've been talking about with customers a lot. New customers never ask that. Like, they look at that for 10 minutes and then they understand it and they're just fine. Those that have worked with the visual editor have been asking us, like, where's that gone? I want it back. Still, it's like the opposite of when Confluence introduced this rich text editor. I thought, oh, it's never going to happen. As you have now built this markup only thing, it has, or building workflows for us has become way more powerful and reliable. So I would be also interested, Simon, what's your take on this shift in your own company and product?
Yeah, so the markup was always, as you said, it was always I think the better option, because it did provide you with a lot more functionality. The visual tool that we'd had a while ago that we removed, it was helpful, but the markup was obviously much gave you a lot more control. Now, but what I can tell you, and this actually might even be news for you, Martin, we are actually in the process now of developing something much more beyond the old visual editor. We're actually creating a workflows builder, which is in beta right now, and it will actually allow you to take advantage of, we're trying to add as much of the markup language functionality into a visually designed tool. So obviously, definitely, I mean, we have lots of customers that are using the product and partners, and as you said, it sometimes will, in the beginning, seems a little bit daunting, but once they've taken 10 minutes to review one, they're like, okay, I understand what's happening here, and they can go and start building their own. And obviously, we provide lots of help if they need it. But we did have a lot of feedback from different groups saying, it would be nice to have more of a visual tool for either space admins that might want to build some of their own, because you do have the option. You might have a space admin that says, well, I need something just for my space that's kind of specific, and I don't really want to have to learn this markup language. So this workflows builder is actually something that's in development right now. We are hoping to have it available by the end of the year, but we will also have a working version of it. We should have a working version of it by the European Summit. So for any of our guests today, if you're happening to be in Barcelona this September, come by and see us, and you can see the first working version of the tool that we'll have available by then. So again, we're working to have the final version hopefully by the end of this year. But again, it was something that came up enough, Martin, that we said, you know what, this is really something that's obviously going to provide value. We're going to keep the markup language again, because there's some people that like that type of development, and it will still give you probably the maximum control, because there's certain things you'll always be able to do with text, rather that'll be easier than with a visual design tool, but it will be much more feature rich than the old visual editor that we had, and really allow people to go in. If it's like, I need to create a few workflows, I want to do it visually, it's going to give them that ability to do that. So we'll have both options available. So that's actually something that we're pretty excited about. And like I said, again, we're hoping to have it in the next few months.
And question about the markup language. Where can I learn this? Is the question. Can you point us or show us the documentation? Where do I begin? How do I get into your product?
Sure, you bet. Yeah, so the best bet, all of this is documented, and actually we've just a few months ago we went and we revamped all of our documentation, so that it was a lot more easy to follow. So I'm just going to pop in and grab a link for you, and I'll actually show you. But all the macros that we have, we'll go to our workflows documentation. So
and here we see the other products as well.
Yeah, some of the other tools are all obviously installed. So we can make this link available, I'm sure, Martin, afterwards, if people want to, but we've just gone through and completely revamped all of our documentation just to make it a lot easier to follow. But if you're really interested in authoring workflows, we have a whole guide that's dedicated just to authoring them. So explaining what the states and the transitions and the tasks are all about. But the page that I probably spend almost all my time when I happen to be in our documentation is our macro page, which really just gives you an example of all the different macros that we're using. So these are the sort of, here's everything you can actually do with the tool with examples. So you can see the workflow macros, the different triggers that you can build in. And you'll just see these over and over again, because we're basically just creating different combinations depending on what you need your workflow to do. So there's quite a few, not a ton, but again, you're going to just see them replicated over and again. They might have a different value here, a different state name there. And then again, there's also examples. So if you want to see adding multiple reviewers, adding page activity to an email, for example. So here's a good example of if you wanted to have multiple reviewers added to a page, you've actually got example code and explanations of how that works. And in fact, you may have spotted, the people that were really paying attention, we've actually included just some beta documentation. We're going to keep building this out, but as we get closer to actually having our visual design tool, you're going to start to see some of the different options. So you saw the visual diagram that we saw before, which is really just a visual way of being able to look at your workflows, which is in the product right now. So if you just want to have a visual idea of what does this workflow look like, but we're actually now expanding that to also be able to build the workflow from that visual space. So keep an eye on that page, and we'll continue to add to it as the product gets developed further.
The preview peek hole.
Exactly.
The documentation actually looks pretty fledged out, and it seems to have seen a lot of work by you guys.
Yeah, definitely. We actually wanted to, last year we realized that there was just some stuff that needed, I think we knew it could be improved. And we wanted to really make it as easy as possible and provide as much content as possible to our users. So we actually completely revamped, we worked with a partner and completely revamped all of our workflows documentation. We're actually going to go ahead and do that with the rest of our docs as well. But workflows, of course, made the most sense because it has sort of the most functionality, and it's the one that most people are using. So we really spent a lot of time and care coming up with a whole new sort of format to just make it easy for people to get in, understand how it works from a user level, and then even get in and start, building their own workflows and administering the tool.
We're approaching the end of this webinar. Is there something, a highlight that you still want to share, something that I interrupted you on, or anything, any tip that you want to share?
Well, I think I probably gave away the biggest one with our workflows builder. So that's definitely one of the features that we're kind of the most excited about. I think it's going to have the biggest impact on the overall user experience. So again, we're really pushing hard for that one. Something else too that we're looking at as we move closer towards the end of the year is that we've also identified that we do have different types of customers that are using the tool in different ways. For example, we have the compliance and some of the more enterprise sort of level customers that have different needs for the type of workflows they're using. And then we have other businesses, depending on how they manage their pages, that may not have the same set of requirements, or they may have fewer requirements. So what we're actually doing as well, are looking at is introducing a different tiering for the product. So what we're looking at releasing later this year as well is the enterprise and compliance version. So we've identified some key features that tend to be more valuable to certain types of clients that need specific features. So they'll be able to get an enterprise version of the tool, and then we'll have our standard, our professional version of the tool that has everything that we've seen today. So again, just trying to create a package or different packages with different, obviously, pricing and functionality to closer align with what our customers want. So instead of having to buy, maybe you don't need all the features, there's a subset of features, having a different tiering of that. And then again, working more into the cloud space as well. So something important to note, probably should have always start with these, but currently Workflows is only available for Confluence Server and Data Center. So it is Data Center ready as well. But we're also working on a cloud version of the tool. So we have right now Workflows Lite for the cloud, which is a very, very basic subset of just approval. It does not provide most of the functionality that we saw today. But what we are working on is a version of Workflows in the cloud that's more comparable to what we've seen today. So that's kind of the next frontier for us as well, of course, is getting into that cloud space. Again, we find a lot of the customers that really need workflows, they tend to be server and data center clients anyway, just for internal reasons, security, things like that. But again, we do want to have a comparable cloud-based offering. So that's sort of the other big sort of step that we're taking over probably the next 8 to 12 months, is a version that will be available for cloud as well as server and data center.
Give us your face for the ending, please. And yeah, Simon, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been something that is creating more work for those people who really or take interest in that. You've shown us a way to your documentation. I think if you're a customer seeing that, this can only be an introduction to the tool. Both applying the ready-made workflows and also changing the workflows is needing some attention and preparation from your organization and yourself. You can have help by partners like Seibert Media, and there's also the documentation. What's the #1 tip that you would give to your customers to apply Comala Workflows to their Confluence instance?
The best tip for sure is check out the documentation first. That's the best advice. But also we do run webinars as well, just on our product. They can sign up from our site. So definitely I would say get as familiar as possible. There's a free version of it that they can try. That's always my biggest piece of advice, is try it out. You'll see how easy it is to use, and then you'll start to get some ideas on how you could apply it to your organization. So in the Atlassian Marketplace, you'll find us there. You can find our Workflows tool, and there's a free trial available. That's always the best way. I would rather have a customer that had already knew that they needed the product and had already tried it out than someone that hadn't fully sort of played around with it yet. So that's my #1 piece of advice, I think, actually, is get the evaluation, try it for yourself, play with some of the built-in workflows, and you'll really get a sense of what it can do for you.
Cool. Simon, thank you so much for being with us today.
Always a pleasure, Martin. Please feel free to invite me back anytime. Take care.